Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the webinar channel of the Association of Certified eDiscovery Specialists. My name is Mike Quadraro. I am the president of ACEDS. Today, we are joined by our partner, eDiscovery Today, the fabulous and wonderful Doug Austin, for a webinar entitled Digital Forensics in Departed Employee Cases. Should be a good one. You can learn more and subscribe to Doug Austin's blog at ediscoverytoday.com. Before we get started, we love questions. We're happy to take your questions. Please use the Q&A widget on the bottom of your screens to submit your questions. You have the option to submit your question anonymously if you so choose. Also, if you'd like a copy of today's slide deck, it should be available in the resources widget located on the bottom of your screen. Without further delay, I am super excited and pleased to introduce Doug Austin, who will take the presentation from here.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the ACEDS webinar on digital forensics in departed employee cases, considerations and strategies for preserving and analyzing critical data. So in response to the chat question, it's both, and we're going to be talking about those considerations and strategies as they apply to digital forensics in departed employee cases. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll discuss how to prepare for cases involving departed employees and how to preserve and analyze data regarding those employees in litigation and investigations. And here's what we'll be talking about today. We'll begin by talking about the wide array of potential data sources that could be involved in departed employee cases. Then we'll talk about the forensic process, including imaging and collection of data related to departed employees, as well as analysis of that data. Then we'll break down some of the specific data sources, including mobile devices and operating systems, as well as data from the cloud and from USB storage devices to talk about specific considerations and nuances within those data sources. As Mike said, we do welcome questions, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can, and we'll try to save some time at the end for questions. And the slides are available in the resources section, and we will also provide a link to those post-webinar as well. This course has been approved for 1.5 hours of COE credit by the State Bar of Georgia, and those 1.5 hours also get ethics credit. If you need to request COE credit in Georgia, email Michelle Kovich at the email address you see there. As for other states, while COE credit isn't explicitly approved, you can request a certificate of attendance for this webinar and apply for out-of-state COE credit on your own. Several states do offer reciprocal credit for COE accredited programs in other states, and we provided a listing of states that may do so. And even if your state isn't listed here, you may still be able to obtain COE credit from your state as well. Never hurts to ask. And of course, any ideas expressed by us here are our own, not those of our organization's clients or partners. So keep that in mind. And certainly that's true even if someday we become departed employees from our organizations. So now let's meet the panelists for today's webinar. And I'll start with Neal. Neal Weinrich knows trade secrets and restrictive covenants inside and out. A shareholder at Berman, Fink, Van Horn, Neal counsels clients in all industries on matters involving trade secrets, non-competes, and other competition-related issues. Neal represents employers and employees as both plaintiffs and defendants in disputes throughout Georgia and in other jurisdictions involving non-competes, customer non-solicits, non-recruits, and non-disclosure covenants. Neal also handles a variety of other business-related matters, including complex commercial litigation, contract disputes, cases involving business torts, partnership or shareholder disagreements, and executive compensation disputes. He's the past chair of the Labor and Employment Committee of the Atlanta Bar Association and currently serves on the vice chair of the Trade Secret Committee of the State Bar of Georgia's Intellectual Property section. Neal also served on the drafting committee on covenants not to compete for the Uniform Law Commission. He also served as the co-chair of the Ethics and Professionalism Committee of the Young Lawyers Division of the State Bar of Georgia. Welcome, Neal.
Thanks, Doug.
Karuna Naik is a seasoned IT professional with a career spanning over 25 years in the field of information technology. Her journey into the world of IT began with a strong academic foundation, earning a BSc degree in computing with mathematics, followed by an MSc in communicating computer systems as a postgraduate. Her career commenced in a high-pressure environment on the trading floor of Baring Securities in London, England, where she provided critical application support to traders. For the next 12 years, Karuna continued her career at Mizuho Capital Markets, specializing in trading room services. Additionally, she managed the network infrastructure, disaster recovery, business continuity planning, and oversaw the desktop and data center environments. Her expertise ensured the uninterrupted operation of Mizuho's critical financial and market data systems. After a 7-year hiatus to raise her children, Karuna re-entered the IT landscape as a network operations center engineer at Dynasis, now Novatech. In this role, she shouldered the responsibility of disaster recovery and business continuity planning for all clients, honing her skills in safeguarding digital assets. In 2019, Karuna joined the company now known as S2 Data as a project manager, quickly transitioning to a forensic examiner role due to her strong technical skills. And in 2022, she was promoted to Director of Forensics and Disputes. She's gained extensive experience in conducting investigations involving various forms of digital data, including mobile devices from the cloud, personal computers, video and security systems, USB devices, and email. Her caseload has encompassed a wide spectrum of legal scenarios such as intellectual property theft, departing employee investigations, traffic and personal accidents, video and security footage analysis, data recovery, location data analysis, and even criminal cases. Greg Freemyer has over 40 years experience in the IT field. Before entering the computer forensics field, he was an IT consultant with numerous firms, including Siemens and Ford Motor Company. He worked on an anti-fraud effort with Ford Motor Company for almost 10 years. From 2017 to 2022, he served as S2 Data's Director of Forensics and Disputes. Last summer, Greg transitioned to his current role, leading their forensic tools development team. Greg continues to work on active forensic cases. He has a broad background in investigative computer forensics and data breach response and has worked as a computer expert since 2005. He has led and participated in numerous investigations to determine the nature and scope of computer and smartphone incidents and any potential data loss. The nature of the IP theft events he's worked on has included both rogue employees and external actors. He's also worked on a number of large number of accident cases. In recent years, his analysis has expanded to include video security systems. For his active cases, he's focused particularly on issues related to intellectual property theft. And in his R&D role, he's leading efforts to develop tools and solutions targeting email and text messages communications. And I'm Doug Austin, the editor of eDiscovery Today, which is a daily blog about eDiscovery, cybersecurity, data privacy, information governance, and AI trends, best practices, and case law. I've been providing consulting and project management services in the legal space for over 30 years, so I know a thing or two because I've seen a thing or two. And I've been daily blogging for nearly 15 years, so I'm either committed or I ought to be. There we go. Thank you. Thank you, Neal. So let's get started and let's set the stage for today's discussion by taking a look at the 2023 Internet Minute infographic from Shameless Plug Warning, eDiscovery Today, and LTMG. This infographic illustrates the big data volume, velocity, and variety that we must all deal with in discovery and forensics today. Email, text and chat messages, social media activity, photos, and a whole lot more are all potentially discoverable sources of ESI in cases involving departed employees, making discovery of that information more complex than ever. So let's talk about some of the challenges and best practices from a legal and technical standpoint associated with identifying data sources, securing them in a timely manner, and obtaining access to those data sources. So Neal, I'll start with you. A lot of companies wind up struggling to identify and collect data from departed employees because of a lack of due diligence when the employee departs. So how should organizations handle the exit interview to position themselves for the possibility of discovering data from departed employees down the road?
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, the key is to make that interview process as robust as possible. Oftentimes, an employee resigns, they've announced that they're going to a competitor, and they're shown the door, their access is cut off, and there's not a thorough and robust exit interview process. You want to do that with employees that are leaving your company, especially that are going to competitors in any and all situations. And when you have that meeting, you want to be thorough. You want to show the employee their agreements, explain to them that, hey, you're obligated under your agreement to return any company property you have, and to walk through with that employee the places where the data sources, the places where company information might not exist. And they might not, that employee, they might not have done anything nefarious, but they might have information in places where it needs to be returned. So ask them, do you have any thumb drives in your office at home? Did you email any documents to yourself or to anybody else, either in anticipation of resigning or in the ordinary course of your employment? Have do you have company files on a personal computer at home? Do you have an old personal computer that might have company files? Ask all these questions and make sure that the employee understands that the goal is for the company to ensure that that employee doesn't have any company information anymore, and that they're obligated under the agreements and policies that are hopefully in place and that govern that employee's relationship, that they're obligated to return that information. Sometimes you're going to have employees that they don't know any better. They might have thought, oh, I'm allowed to take this for my personal portfolio, or they might have sent a document to themselves thinking they could keep it. And those employees might say, I didn't realize I couldn't do that. Let me hop in here and delete it. Sometimes you're going to have nefarious employees that aren't going to disclose what they should. And what I would do is at the end of that interview, have the employees, the good and the bad, sign a checklist where they they sign, warrant, and represent that I don't have anything or I've given everything back. And that employee that is a bad actor and took information and didn't disclose it, when you eventually hire a forensic examiner like Greg and Karuna and you bring them in and they take a look, the fact that that employee misrepresented that they didn't have information, it's only going to make the case stronger.
Yeah, absolutely. So the great discussion of exit interviews, which I was familiar with, but during our prep call, we talked about another interview that you can, a type of interview that you conduct, the entry interview. So what are you looking to accomplish during that interview?
Yeah, Doug, this is something that I think is really important for companies that are hiring employees from competitors. I know probably in the last 10 to 20 years, those companies have been very mindful about wanting to avoid these trade secret disputes where an employee that they hire inadvertently, intentionally, whatever it is, brings over information from old company to new company, and new company finds themselves drawn into a nasty, ugly, expensive dispute. When new company is hiring, whether it's one employee from a competitor or if it's a team of employees from the competitor, I always think it's a good idea to have those employees meet with their own counsel. It's usually better that it's their own counsel than counsel for NewCo. NewCo can be involved in connecting the employee with counsel, but have counsel interview that employee and make sure that they understand, if there wasn't that exit interview, that made sure that they don't have anything. Walk them through same kind of questions, right? Did you give everything back? Do you have anything at home? Do you have anything in cloud storage backups? Do you have any thumb drives? Then if any information exists, you figure out what the contractual obligations are to return it, figure out whether there's any reason to go ahead and preserve it. Again, get a forensic examiner like Greg and Karuna involved to the extent that you need to preserve any accounts before you're removing the data that exists in the account or on the device. Take that step, and what the ultimate goal is to ensure that if you're NewCo's lawyer, if you work at NewCo, if you're in IT for NewCo, the day that employee or that team of employees starts, you don't want any of them to have any company information from Oldco, so that when they start, they're clean, and you've eliminated any possibility of dissemination, any Oldco's information getting into your organization and creating a problem. And it requires more than putting in the agreement or putting in the offer letter saying, hey, we don't want any of your former employer's stuff, right? That's good to do, and we need to do that, but you want to be proactive and you want to meet and interview and talk to these hires and make sure they really understand and really quiz them and make sure, hey, you don't have anything, you didn't take anything. That's what we do when we're helping companies on that hiring side of kind of the entry interview to avoid a problem before you really have one.
Yeah, yeah, great advice because you don't, as a new company, you don't want to get dragged into something. So obviously, that's a great best practice there. So let's switch over to the technical side now. So Karuna, when it comes to a case involving departed employees, as we saw on the previous slide, there's a lot of potential data sources that could be available. So how do you go about identifying the actual data sources that are available?
Yep, thanks, Doug. So really, this is a fact-finding mission. My advice would be to speak to HR, to management, to colleagues that actually worked with or are working with the departed employee, and also, talk to IT. Gather as much information as you can. Identify what the employee's role was, what access did they have to what systems, what devices were actually assigned to them, if they are company-issued devices, things like, the access levels or the permissions that they may have had or still do. And basically, were there any issues leading up to the departure? Was there any unusual behavior? Were IT seeing, uploads or downloads of company files to cloud drives maybe, or external devices, or even emailing, company documents to personal email accounts? The obvious data sources, of course, are going to be, the actual devices like laptops, desktop PCs, mobile, devices like cell phones and tablets. Often what gets missed are the external storage devices. So they could be thumb drives or USB, devices. And they can be used just as part of, the workflow. It doesn't, just because somebody's copying data to these devices during the course of their employment doesn't mean that they're doing anything untoward. They could be copying files on there, for a good reason. But those devices often get missed. There are other sources like IoT devices, especially for point of sale systems or even lab equipment. I actually had to go and do a collection up at one of the Ivy League universities up in Connecticut last year. And I had to image some of the lab equipment there. And that lab equipment, they are shared devices. So it's not just a device that a specific custodian had access to. So shared devices are also something to consider. And then you've got your systems that are cloud-based. You have your CRM systems, where those kind of systems actually contain contact information for clients. A case we worked on a couple of years ago, a custodian was actually, she had access to multiple CRM systems, and she was downloading the contacts lists from all of them. She didn't think she was actually doing anything wrong, but she had complete access to all the client information, all the contact details to take to the next company she was about to start. Other sources of data, you've got your cloud data, your email, your cloud drives, you've got company share files and OneDrives, Google Drives even. iCloud Drive could also be a possible data source. And even iCloud Photos. Nowadays, over the last probably 10 years or so, or at least primarily over the last 5 years or so, people use their phones to take photos of documents. If they're in meetings or of whiteboards, there's company information on a whiteboard typically. Or, if somebody's sharing a PowerPoint presentation at a meeting, there could be relevant company data that they're capturing, from a photo. So those are definitely important data sources. And then you've also got your third-party tools, which could be in-house or they could be, cloud-based. But one more or a couple more data sources that often get forgotten too are your backups. So data sources, important data sources could be backups, whether they're company backups or whether they are personal backups, like iCloud backup as an example of a device. And then the last thing I'd mention is definitely an important data source is your litigation hold area. So for example, in Office 365, you have that area that can often contain some really relevant artifacts.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a ton of data sources there. So even a couple of that I wouldn't have thought of. So I'm going to combine the next two questions here a little bit. Obviously, you can't examine data sources that no longer exist. So what recommendations do you have for our audience to ensure they secure data sources in a timely manner? And how do you work with your clients to obtain access to the data sources in the first place?
So I think the key word here is cooperation. You definitely need cooperation from multiple parties. For me, I think the first step is actually understanding what the nature of the investigation is. What are the client's needs and what are the data types that need to be preserved or collected? This helps really to determine where the data is and how you're actually going to access the data as a forensic examiner to preserve it. This often involves working directly with the custodian. Sometimes it involves working with IT to obtain things like passcodes or encryption keys. And it also involves nowadays multi-factor authentication steps. So maybe 4 or 5 years ago, it was very easy to collect email from the cloud, whether it would be personal email like Gmail or Yahoo, or even corporate email like Microsoft. I could collect the data. All I needed was the username and the password to the account. There was no two-step, verification or anything like that. I was just able to log in and download the data that I needed. Unfortunately, nowadays, for forensic examiners, it's becoming more and more challenging to actually access the data that needs to be collected, because often there'll be multi-factor authentication in place, and that can come in varying forms. Typically it would be a code that's texted to the actual mobile device for the user. Sometimes it will be a code that's sent via email. And if it's Google data, typically Google will send a notification and it will ask you to open an app on your phone and confirm the code, on the app. The first time I experienced that, it asked me to open the YouTube app on the device. That's not quite the typical app I would expect you to do authentication, with. But I would say, to answer the question about what recommendations I have to secure the data sources, I would say time is definitely of the essence. Typically, try and schedule a forensic collection as soon as you can, if that's feasible. Take possession of the devices and really isolate them from the network, the company network, as well as the internet, in case some kind of remote wiping is enabled. We've had cell phones, where iPhones specifically, where remote wiping has been enabled on the phone. And you want to make sure that that device is not connected to the internet. You want to reduce that risk of having that remote wiping take place. Lots of advice, I would say power the devices off is typically my recommendation. If the device is unlocked, providing you know what the passcode and the password is to unlock it, definitely power the device off. And definitely more so in the case for mobile devices, cell phones and tablets. You can leave those devices powered on and not actively use them. I could have my cell phone sitting next to me all day and not touch it, but it's powered on. What happens in the background is artifacts get overwritten continuously. So, you're not preserving the data on the device if you're having it powered on. So the best thing to do really is power the device off, especially for, accident type cases where you really need to preserve data on the cell phone. You want to see what users are doing. Were they actually on their phone, when the accident happened? So try and preserve as much as you can by powering off those devices. And of course, access to the data, you would need relevant passwords, PIN codes, encryption keys to devices and accounts. And one of my recommendations also is if it's a mobile device, cell phone, or a tablet, go ahead and disable those automatic operating system updates. The problem is nowadays, especially, there are more frequent iOS updates for iPhones, especially. Every month at least, there's a new iOS update or there's something or other, whether it be a minor update or a major update. The problem with the forensic tools, especially on the major updates, is they don't always have extraction methods available if a device is on the newest, iOS or Android OS. So my advice would be disable those automatic OS updates. That will give you the best opportunity to extract data from these devices and not have to wait until that device is actually supported by the forensic provider, the forensic software provider. And I would also say with some of the messaging apps, you can change the settings on those messaging apps to automatically delete messages after a certain time frame. So, for example, on an iPhone, you can set that time to 30 days or a year or never. So if it's set to 30 days, your text messages that are older than 30 days automatically get deleted. So you want to try and, disable those features. You want to keep those text messages and other data on the phone if it's a cell phone. I could go on and on, but there are a few more important points that I would definitely like to say. Disabling access to accounts as soon as possible, but don't delete the data.
Right.
So, sometimes you can go and disable access, but the data gets deleted. Disabling access, you could change the passwords. And I would advise you to reset any shared passwords for sure. And I think another important one where we always run into, not always, but quite often, we run into issues with, especially for corporations. Their typical procedure would be an employee leaves, whatever company issued devices they have, they'll go in and hand to HR or to IT. What IT typically will do is either, depending on the policies that they have in place, they'll go in and wipe those devices. Or they will log in if it's say a Windows device. They'll log in and they'll look to see what's on there. And what they're doing by logging in, first of all, is changing timestamps, access timestamps. And by them poking around, in File Explorer or whatever tool they choose to use, they're updating file metadata on these devices. And they're contaminating basically forensic artifacts. And these are the artifacts that forensic examiners like Greg and myself rely on to actually build a timeline of what activity a user has, what they've actually done on their device. So that's definitely an important one. And, still sticking with IT, more often than not, for these company issued devices, what they'll do is they'll have things like BitLocker encryption keys, things like that are available in their management area. So they will typically go in and remove their devices from whatever management tool they're using. And once that's done, they've lost those BitLocker encryption keys. And as examiners, we're finding probably, I would say 90% of the devices that we receive that are laptops or desktops, they're all encrypted. Typically, it's BitLocker encryption. Without those BitLocker encryption keys or passwords, we can't actually decrypt any of the data. We can image the devices easily, but we can't decrypt the data. So the image is pretty much useless because we can't interpret anything, that's on that. But I would definitely say revisit those IT policies, especially with regards to, automatic wiping, even removing mobile device management from devices. When doing that, you can also delete data quite easily. But I would say it's definitely a good idea to document device possession. So once you have access to a physical device, as forensic examiners, we always complete those chain of custody forms. And those are really for legal and investigative purposes. There's always, a chain of custody for any device that we have in our possession. And the dates on those forms are actually very important too, because if a departed employee had access to a device, the last day that they had that device was, say, July 7th. At the end of the day, they handed that device over to HR or to IT. That chain of custody, if it's filled in, has that July 7th timestamp. So when it actually comes to a forensic examiner and they've imaged the device and they're running analysis, they know that anything that happened before July 7th was, going to be activity that the custodian did. Anything after that date typically would be IT or somebody's kind of logged into the device, and those kind of artifacts can be ignored. So those are, a lot of the main things that I would like to point out.
Okay, yeah, we could write a whole article or even a white paper on all those best tips and practices. Got a couple of great questions from the audience. One of them I'll save. It's related to when we get to the mobile devices slide, but I'll throw this one out right now. Are there certain solutions within a preservation in place workflow that can mitigate data loss when an employee leaves the company? If so, what should be considered when preservation in place is being considered? Karuna or Greg, any comments, response to that question?
Here, I'll take that. So, preservation in place, what we see typically is a lot of people using the Microsoft 365 suite, and it has eDiscovery litigation hold mechanisms. So I don't see a lot of preservation in place for just a routine employee. But when somebody is high profile or they are in a litigation hold scenario, whatever it may be, we absolutely see the litigation hold module of Office 365 engaged. And that will preserve, like deleted emails. They move into a litigation hold area. They don't actually get deleted from the server. The same thing for OneDrive. If you're under that hold and you delete files, they get moved as opposed to actually deleted. So from the user's perspective, they're gone. They don't have to interact with them anymore. They don't see them anymore, but they're still available. So using litigation hold as a technical feature is a great thing. It's not in the lower cost subscriptions of Office 365, but most larger companies in particular pay for a more sophisticated Office 365 offering, and then they're able to leverage those tools. And we see it routinely. It's not an unusual or strange thing to see a litigation hold. So we always ask if that's in place. And then for iPhones in particular, the cloud syncs are extremely useful. We have had situations where a user might have, I don't know, 5,000 text messages on his phone, but we go look at the cloud sync area and there's 100,000 text messages that have been preserved over the last decade. Because iPhones have been out now for close to 20 years. I don't know when they first started doing synchronization to the cloud, but it's been at least 10 years. So there's a lot of text messages potentially in the cloud that are not on the device. And unfortunately, when you delete something from the phone, it does delete from the cloud. I don't know how to stop that from happening. But as long as you educate the custodians, users, not to delete important business records from their phone, they will stay in the cloud if you have the synchronization turned on. And so when that phone falls in the river or falls in the lake, and that happens in the real world, it's not just because somebody's trying to delete data. Devices get lost, they get destroyed. So having everything synchronized allows those business records to be maintained.
Yeah. Or like me carrying it into having it in my pocket and taking it into the pool a few years ago. So, it happens. These things happen. So, Greg, obviously, if a company fails to preserve ESI, that could lead to sanctions. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that extends to ESI for departed employees as well. So, do you have an example of a case involving a departed employee and spoliated ESI leading to sanctions?
Sure, I've been doing this for about 20 years, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to talk about the actual legal sanctions, but I will talk about some of the costs because people don't realize that when you cause a potential spoliation issue, you have to spend a lot of money sometimes to recover from that situation. And one in particular I'm thinking of, there were four engineers from Augusta, which is the home of the Masters. So they were out there doing their thing, and they decided to leave their former employer or their current employer at the time and form their own engineering company. And they walked away with approximately 20 terabytes of engineering data. So it was an absolute massive amount of engineering data that they took with them. Um, and I was called in to go to a pre-deposition day where they brought in all their devices. They filled up a conference room with all the devices these engineers brought in because they had a lot of stuff. And the next day they were going to be deposed. Well, they didn't leave their phones with me that first day because they needed those for their normal activity, and they were going to turn over their phones during the deposition process. And I would preserve the phone while they were being deposed, so they really wouldn't miss the fact that they were out of touch with their phone for a few hours. Well, one of the engineers, when he gets into deposition, and I've got his phone and I'm making the preservation, they ask him if he's deleted any text messages off of his phone recently. And he was just naive and he said, "Oh, yeah, I deleted some last night." Well, why did you delete some last night? Well, I was given us some advice that it'd be smart to get rid of anything that might be problematic off the phone before the deposition. Really? So how many text messages do you think you deleted last night? Oh, I don't know, thousands. So the night before deposition, clearly under litigation hold, this man deleted thousands of text messages. So I was already engaged, but now the scope of what I was to do grew. What could we do to try to recover those thousands of deleted text messages? And so I'd already made what's called a Celebrite collection from the phone. That included all the text messages, all the background data, the databases, the raw data. And I went through all that raw data and I recovered thousands of deleted text messages. Plus, I went to his cloud account, iCloud, and pulled down the synchronized data I was talking about a minute ago. In his case, the synchronization had not occurred, so I had a lot more data in the cloud than officially in existing space on the phone. And I did an analysis, basically message by message by message, to determine how many messages were in the cloud that were not in the phone from the time frame. And I was able to put together a very convincing case that I was able to recover a vast majority of the text messages that were deleted because we had the two different sources that come from it. And I could compare them. And so I actually was able to push back on a legal spoliation sanction. But my bill for all that work, including the actual forensic work of the computer analysis and the external drives, but a tremendous amount of it was the cell phone analysis, was in excess of $100,000. So that had to be borne, of course, by these four engineers. So it may not have been a sanction from the judge. It may not have been an official dollar amount, but it was a huge expense to be carried by these engineers. So it's very expensive to try to remedy a claim of spoliation. And that's where I often get engaged is there's a claim of spoliation and the lawyer sort of open up the checkbook and say, whatever we need to spend, we need to recover everything we possibly can to get that data back. So again, it's not a sanction, but it's almost as bad as one because opening up the checkbook is no fun.
That's for sure. Great example. So obviously that's the technical side of things. Neal, can you briefly talk about Federal Civil Rule 37E and how it's used to determine the application and severity of sanctions?
Yeah, sure, Doug. I'm sure most people watching this are familiar with Rule 37E, but essentially there's two prongs to it. Under the first scenario where there's an obligation to preserve evidence and there's a negligent failure to do so where it's not intentional, then sanctions can be awarded, and you have to have a showing of prejudice to the other side. For example, if the other side was able to, if text messages were deleted by the bad actor, but they were able to get all those text messages from the other side of the conversation, you aren't going to have the existing prejudice to support sanctions. But when you do have that prejudice, the remedy is what are the appropriate level of sanctions necessary to cure the prejudice. So we don't have these text messages. We're going to draw the inference that these text messages wouldn't have been favorable, but we're not going to go farther in, striking an answer or anything like that. On the other hand, the other prong is 3072, when you have an intent to deprive. So the employee leaves, they know they've taken information, they get a cease and desist letter, and they go wipe the hard drive that they copied everything to. They intentionally do it to hide the evidence of their misconduct. Obviously, Greg and Karuna are going to find that. They're going to figure it out. But where you have that intentional destruction of evidence, that's where a court has more latitude to impose more severe sanctions, like striking an answer or monetary sanctions. So that's Rule 3070 in a nutshell.
Yeah, and the whole intent to deprive question is one that is a little hard to define sometimes. So, but certainly interesting. Okay, so we want to do a little catch up here, kind of move on and get into the forensic process associated with data for departed employees. So let's start with a discussion about data collection and forensic imaging. And Greg, I'll start with you. When an employee leaves, some organizations will take and store their devices in a closet in case they need them later. Is that good enough? And if it's not good enough, what do they need to do to ensure that preservation of the data is conducted defensibly?
So we see that a lot, and I've heard of companies with thousands of hard drives or computers stored away in a closet, and they think that is the ultimate solution. So first of all, the problem we're seeing a lot today that we didn't encounter years ago is what Karuna mentioned. It's the BitLocker keys. So companies are putting those devices into a closet, and then they're telling the IT team, "Hey, we've got it preserved. Go ahead and retire that system." So they take it out of Active Directory. It's no longer there, and then a year goes by, and they ask us to analyze it. We say, "Well, what's the BitLocker key?" And they say, "Oh, we don't know. It's inside the Active Directory, and we've deleted that account." So we're at a loss. And often we'll then ask, well, what's the administrator login? And that too, they won't have. If we're lucky, they'll say, we do have the administrator account, but we're not willing to share it with you. Send the device back to us. We will set up a new login just for you. Then you can log in and get access to the machine and do what you need to do. If we have administrator rights, we can often collect that BitLocker key and then do the decryption at the forensic level. But we have to have administrator rights, not just a user's rights. And then the second problem with the put everything in a closet approach is things fail just over time. We always make it a practice that we make at least 2 copies of everything we image. So we make the image plus we make a copy of that image, and we verify that. We make sure that we've got something that can be used if the original goes away. And typically that's exactly what we recommend is send us the device, let us image it, make our own secondary copy, and then you can send that device back to IT. They can put it back into service, wipe all the data off of it, just continue on. You don't need the original device for court. I've never seen a situation where the court said, hey, I need to see the original laptop. That's why we make the forensic image, we record the serial numbers and the technical information, and that's available to present to the court. And I've seen no trouble with that at all from a chain of custody perspective.
Okay. So see the bullet point in industry standard forensic tools there. So quickly, what are some of the tools that are being used by forensic examiners today to ensure a forensically sound collection?
So there's a number of forensic imaging tools. In the cell phone world, we use Celebrite, and that's a very widely known name. Lawyers should know that name and be familiar with it, even if they don't know what it does. In the world of computers, there's much broader set of tools. We use something called EWF Acquire. Probably nobody's even heard of that, but it's a Linux tool designed for this process. It's supported by a Google employee that writes and maintains that particular tool. Um, and then there are lots of handheld devices designed for it. There are write blockers to prevent anybody from modifying the device. There's FTK Imager, which is great in a RAID environment where you got a complex disk array. So there are a number of digital imaging collection devices. As long as it's specified to be for forensic imaging, I think we're fine. The trouble people get into is in the old days, there was a tool called Ghost, and there are lots of other similar tools today that are made for IT administrators. And they claim to do imaging as well, but they do not capture all of unallocated space. Their goal is to make a replication of the usable portion of the data of the disk, not all the forensic artifacts. So it's very important to use a tool that claims it's for forensic use, not IT administrator use.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. So, Karuna, I've covered many cases where parties perform self-collection of their own ESI. Quickly, what are some of the potential challenges that can arise from doing so?
Although self-collections can save money in the short term, they'll probably cost you a lot more money in the longer term. They basically alter critical metadata, file metadata specifically. And most of the individuals that are doing these collections lack the technical knowledge. And that can really lead to inadvertent spoliation. And even IT make mistakes. You know, when you're copying files or folders using File Explorer, you copy from one place to another. The destination where you're copying the files to, they're going to have different timestamps. Then they don't have, the timestamps preserved. But with forensic examiners, we have proper forensic tools that we use to preserve the data in a defensible manner. And we, as I mentioned before, we maintain proper chain of custody documentation. One of the other big things about the self-collections is that they're not comprehensive collections typically. They don't include unallocated space. They don't include deleted files. We as examiners, using our forensic tools, do have that ability to access those deleted files or the unallocated areas using our forensic tools. And I think also one of the big things with self-collections is data could get missed or data sources could be overlooked. And, if this goes to trial, there could be credibility issues to kind of take into consideration and possibly even legal consequences.
Great, great segue into my question for Neal, because I've certainly seen cases where parties have been taken to task for how they've handled self-collection. So, Neal, what are some of the potential legal ramifications associated with self-collection? What issues have you seen arise in courts when parties handle collection poorly?
Yeah, the typical legal issues are going to be, loss of proof or potentially spoliation sanctions. So, the easiest example that I can think of, we had a case several years ago. We were representing the departing employee, and they had copied some information to a hard drive. And early on in that case, we did like what we're supposed to do, return that hard drive to the plaintiff's counsel saying, he shouldn't have it, we're giving it back, mea culpa. Well, that hard drive was obviously critical evidence in the case, and the plaintiff's counsel, it turned out, they started messing around and looking what was on the hard drive as opposed to they should have gotten it and made a preservation copy of it, and then set that aside. And they ended up altering the metadata on the hard drive so that there was no longer clean and clear evidence as to what was on the hard drive, when it was last accessed, all of that. So the biggest issue beyond spoliation is the potential loss of evidence and loss of key evidence that could be used in a case. I mean, the other example is kind of along the lines of what Karuna was alluding to. When you have someone internally at the company, you've got an employee that leaves and IT says, let's look at their computer and see what we can see. As soon as they've turned on that computer, before they've even started looking, they're altering key data that's going to be relevant when that computer gets turned over to Greg and Karuna to examine. And step one is obviously preserve, right, before anybody touches it. So the key in my mind is the key ramification is evidence that that former employer may need or want to prove their case is disappearing as soon as somebody besides a forensic examiner is touching that device, preserving it, and then doing the analysis.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And certainly not every case is that data going to be as critical, but certainly in departed employee cases and potentially involving IP, that data could be very critical. So now I think getting on to what might be my favorite slide in the deck, a discussion of forensic analysis techniques and the insights that can be gained from a forensic expert applying those techniques. So, Greg, let's talk about what when you're able to perform a forensically sound collection from a device. Could you walk us through some of the ways in which you analyze the data, what you're looking for, and why?
Sure, and I do this dozens of times a year, so this is a very routine thing for us. We do a lot of these departed employee cases, and this is exactly what we do on each and every one of them. So the first thing is the USB device connectivity. We can go into a laptop and pull out various artifacts and recreate a lot of the timeline. What devices were connected? When were they connected? When were they pulled back out? What was going on? What browsing activity took place? So there's just a lot of activity. By browsing, I mean File Explorer. So we find very often users will copy on a lot of data and then open up their File Explorer and go look at it to make sure that they got what they thought they got. Or they'll copy on a spreadsheet and then they'll open up the spreadsheet to confirm that it has the content they want to have. So we see an awful lot of those artifacts can be pieced together into a timeline. And then the next thing it's showing on our list here is the file transfers. What I'll do is if I have a device that's plugged in for a short period of time, like a thumb drive for 10 minutes or a USB drive for an hour, I will go through the laptop or desktop computer and look at last access date for each and every file to see what was accessed during that window of time when the USB device was connected. And it turned 20 years ago, that was a great approach. I did that a lot around 2005, 2007 when I first got into this field. And then Microsoft turned off tracking of last access. So some of the people on this call may be going, last access is useless because it's not tracked anymore. Well, for good news, Microsoft turned it back on at least 5 years ago. So in general, last access is available. So we have that information on your computers, your laptops, desktops, whatever it may be. Almost always today, last access date is available, and I can tell you which files were accessed while a thumb drive or USB drive was connected. That is the strongest piece of evidence I really can bring to bear. It's really powerful and persuasive that they plugged in this device for 30 minutes, and during this 30 minutes, they accessed these 3,000 files. If it's only one or two files, they can argue, hey, while I had it plugged in, I happened to open up the spreadsheet financial records for the company. No, it's just a pure chance. But when I can say, hey, no, not only did you open up that file, but you accessed these 3,000 files and you did them just within seconds of each other. So it took a total of 20 minutes for you to access 3,000 files. I can say with a high degree of confidence, I believe those files got copied onto the external drive. And now we move forward in discovery. The lawyers all know that you have things you can look at that you have custody of during your examination in your early phase process. But at some point, you have to go through the discovery to get to the other side's information. So during the discovery phase, if we can get a court order requiring the departed employee to turn over their thumb drives or to turn over their home computer or turn over the computer at their new employer, I've seen all those scenarios many times. It's very common that the evidence that I find on the initial work computer, it's not proof of wrongdoing, but it's proof or strong evidence that intellectual property was taken, moved to an external drive, and may or may not have been improperly used thereafter. But it's a stepping stone approach. So it's very, very important for us to do that. So going back through some more of these reports, Again, that USB report is my favorite and by far the most convincing to me. But file access activity, sometimes I'll find that they opened up files that they shouldn't have even had any reason to open up, especially if it's in their last week or so of employment. Why were they looking at the employment records of all their employees as they're walking out the door? It just doesn't make sense necessarily for a manager to be doing that. The file metadata analysis, we do that a lot for the last access date. Oh, free space and deletion analysis. That's something I also do in almost every case. It's very common for users to delete a large amount of data as they're leaving. They think that it's doing them a favor. It's really not. Almost always, especially if it's in the last days, we can recover that and recover even the file names. So we get a pretty comprehensive collection of what was it they got rid of as they're walking out the door. And especially if that might be related to the new job or to the new business they're about to start, it can be very informative to know what did they delete as they were walking out the door. If they're deleting their own corporate records, for the old employer, that's not necessarily such a problem. Although I've been engaged in at least one case where they took that to criminal court as a criminal destruction of property because it was the sole copy of those records. So it was very damaging to see all that deleted. Um, Browser activity and analysis. What I find very useful there is particularly keyword searches. Uh, when you see somebody searching for information, or let's say they search for how to delete records, how to delete information so it can't be found, there's really some very surprising things you find in the Google search terms. So I always review that and send that on to my clients for them to review as well. Of what sort of things are they searching for and attempting to do. Photos in the OCR. Karuna mentioned that before. We see that a lot today. Photographs that have relevant business records embedded in the photo itself. Because lots of people take photos of business records now. Just they're not trying to steal it, they just happen to have it. So we want to make sure that that is recovered. And then the printed document analysis. Inside of a Word doc or an Excel, there's internal metadata that tracks the date of last print. That can be very useful. If somebody prints hundreds of documents in their last few weeks, we can try to track that down and present that to the lawyer. And once again, move the discovery process forward to say, hey, where are all these documents? Why did you print all this material?
Yeah, those are some great examples, and thanks for walking us through that. And comment from the audience about also getting the serial number of the connected drives to support your investigation. So definitely another good piece of information to capture. So Neal, as a lawyer working with a forensic professional, what do you need to know to ensure you get the information you need from people like Greg and Karuna to support your case? And how do you track the evidence that's been collected and analyzed by your forensic team?
Yeah, for me, the first part of that question is when I'm working with a forensic examiner like Greg and Karuna, and they can simplify it down for me, that's often the best thing. And when I say that, I mean, what I'm referring to is, in that scenario where I have a client that has an employee, they left, they went to a competitor, there's concern that maybe they took information, maybe they're violating restrictive covenants. I'm going to send that computer to Greg and Karuna. They're going to do that typical analysis that they do, and they're going to generate, Greg just alluded to it, a spreadsheet that it might have between 50 and 75 tabs of all sorts of different artifacts of here's the user files that they accessed, here's the website activity for 5 different browsers, here's USBs connected, files accessed, all different things. And there could be 100,000 pieces of data, rows of data in that spreadsheet. And what's really useful is when Greg and Karuna will sit with me for an hour, schedule a meeting, and say, all right, here's the report. Here are the 10 things that we think are most important. And here's what I think you need to focus on. And here's some things to look at. Don't worry about these 25 tabs. Really focus on this, this, and this, because there's massive amounts of data there. Some of it is useful and interesting, and some of it is not going to be particularly relevant, or it may be so voluminous that it's not necessarily critical at that early stage in these fast-moving cases to really focus on. So I find, the forensic examiner sort of thinking like a lawyer and presenting it in a really tight, useful fashion so that I have what I need to, what I focus on, what I can focus on, what I can, really be worried about. On the evidence tracking, I view that as it's a litigation management exercise. These cases involving departing employees, they get really big really quickly. So, if a team of 5 employees goes to a competitor and, like Greg said, the court orders all of those devices and accounts that former employee, all those former employees has, be imaged and subject to collection and analysis. Out of the gate, you could have, that could be a phone, a personal computer, an email account, a cloud storage account, another email account, and an iPad. So you've got 6 devices, 5 employees. Before we know it, we've got 30 devices that have been imaged and that have relevant data that we need to keep track of. For Greg and Karuna, they will use, evidence tracker spreadsheets that become sort of a starting point tool for me and my team to then figure out, okay, what are we doing with the data on this particular device? Are we going to focus on this? Have we reviewed it? Who's reviewing it? What do we find? And then that you got to keep managing that over the course of the case, right? Because that initial analysis, you might find a lot of things that are useful and interesting, and then things that don't seem interesting in that time. But 7 months later, lo and behold, there's another employee, and you learn something from investigating that particular employee, and you go back to employee number 3 at the beginning, and there's information on one of their devices that all of a sudden, it's relevant. And if you're tracking kind of where everything is and what's there in a way, and you're, continuing to update that as the case progresses, I think that's the way to, it's all about effective litigation management and, assigning one person on a litigation team that their job is focused on managing the evidence that is coming out of a forensic protocol that's executed by Greg and Karuna or someone like them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, the more the lawyers can speak geek, and the more the geeks can speak legal, and the more cooperation you have, the better, right? So, absolutely. All right, so now we're going to drill down into specific sources of ESI, and we've got about 50 minutes of stuff to cover in about 30 minutes, so we're going to pick up the pace here a little bit. Karuna, I'll start with you this time. Most people today are, of course, either on iPhones or Android devices. So how similar are they from a forensic collection standpoint? What are the things you need to consider when collecting from each type of device?
Yeah, so in terms of forensic tools, they can collect data from Android and iOS devices. But you've also got to bear in mind that some of the data that is accessed on a mobile device is actually fully up in the cloud. There may be artifacts that are downloaded, onto the cell phone, but you don't have a full collection of the data on the cell phone. When I say that, you've got, things like social media apps. You can access your social media accounts on your cell phone, but you don't have everything in your social media account actually physically on your cell phone. It's all cloud-based. You'll have the most recent, posts or data that you've accessed, but you just won't have, have everything. So some data is not physically, on the device. It's only available in cloud as well. Some of that data could be chat data. As an example, the Telegram chat app, that is cloud-based. So you're not going to find really anything on the cell phone for that. So you would have to do a cloud collection for that. And the same with the social media accounts. Most of the social media platforms nowadays allow you to export text messages or chat data, activity logs, things like that. So additionally, from collecting from the devices would be standard, but we typically nowadays also collect a lot of data from the cloud. There are also other issues that potentially could arise. Some apps like Signal require additional kind of security steps in order to be able to collect that data. It could be something like scanning QR codes. And then for iOS devices, there's data that's up in iCloud. So you've got your iCloud backups, you've got iMessages that can be synced to iCloud. You've got iCloud Drive, and Macs also should be considered, especially if you have a user that is an iOS user or an Apple user. They may have a personal Mac, and more often than not, on the Macs, we find iMessages on there. So when we image those using different forensic tools to the Windows devices, we're able to extract the iMessage data from the databases on the Mac, as well as email. Email is also synced down. For Android devices, it's just not as simple. The backups, there aren't backups that are stored in the cloud like they are, for iOS devices. But saying that, with an Android device, Google stores a lot of data up in Google's cloud. So you may have, you've got your Google Drive, you've got your Gmail, things like that. But there are a ton of activity logs that are stored up in Google's cloud. It's pretty scary what they track. But if you ever do a collection of your Google data, you probably be pretty shocked to find, how granular the logs are.
Yes, I'm shocked that Google tracks all that much data, right? Yes, of course. No, we're yes, I probably wouldn't be shocked, but then again, maybe I would. So we had a question from the audience. I said we would get to when we got to the mobile slide, and I'm going to kind of work it into the question I'm going to ask you, Neal. Basically, the question for Neal is, basically parties in litigation used to agree not to go after discovery from mobile devices because they were burdensome to collect from. Now we've seen several cases where parties didn't have to address discovery of BYOD devices of their employees because those devices weren't in their possession, custody, control. What recommendations do you have for our audience on how lawyers should handle requesting or producing mobile device data? And also consider this question from the audience, which is, are there let's see. Well, there we go. Any advice on approaching devices where the employee uses a personal device for business purposes where they did not sign a BYOD agreement? So with that in mind, Neal, the floor is yours.
Sure. When a company is on the receiving end of a request for phone data, and those devices belong to the company employees, and kind of whether there is a BYOD policy, and if a employee agreed to one, and depending on whether that BYOD policy addresses a personal device being submitted for discovery and litigation, the overarching approach when you're involved on behalf of the company, in my view, is you want to look out for the company. So if you know that that there is relevant information on the employee's personal device, you want to make sure that the company is doing everything within its power to make sure that that information is preserved. So, communicating that obligation to the employee. Obviously, there's always a strategic decision to be made. Are we going to produce that information in response to requests made to the company, or are we going to require the other side to serve a subpoena on the individual to get information on the personal device? That's every situation is going to be different as to what's the right approach. But whichever one you take, you want to make sure that that information is there and it stays there and it's not deleted, it doesn't disappear, and that the company's done everything within its power to, even if the company decides it's going to put the other side through the hoops of serving a subpoena on that individual to get that data, that you still want, it's going to be better for the company and of course better for the individual if the individual completely understands that they have an obligation to preserve that data and that they take appropriate steps to do that. Now, in the situation where the employee has not, it's bring your own device to work, but maybe the employee hasn't signed the BYOD agreement, and it might be predictable that that employee is going to be a challenge in when it comes to either cooperating and providing information on that personal device, or even cooperating in a preservation effort. That's where it's probably most important, where the company could predict, hey, down the road, we want to make sure that there's letters in the file that we've told this company to, or we've told this individual to preserve this, so that just in case on Memorial Day that phone falls in the lake, that there can never be a claim against the company that they spoliated evidence, that the record is clear that the company doesn't have possession, custody, or control of that device and the information on it. Nevertheless, the company went out of its way to try and ensure that that information continued to exist. And if it's anybody's fault, it's that employees and not the company, and that the company shouldn't be subject to any kind of sanctions or anything like that. When you're on the other side of this, when you're on the requesting side, my view is be proactive, be assertive, try and get to the bottom quickly of, having a dialogue with the lawyer on the other side and say, our expectation is that, the group of people, the team of executives, the co-workers that were involved in recruiting and hiring these 2 or 3 employees that you hired, we're going to expect text messages and chat messages and other data from their phones, those individuals' phones, to be subject to searches and production in this litigation. We want to understand now, is the company collecting and preserving that data, or is the company's position that that data is in their personal possession and the company is not going to give us that data, and we need to go start serving subpoenas on each of those individuals to make sure that we get that information? Or at a minimum, do we want to send out evidence preservation letters to those individuals? Being on the front end of that dialogue and thinking about, okay, what are we going to ask for in discovery? Who's going to have it? And is there going to be debate over whether that is company information or individual information? It's better to be having that discussion in a 26F conference than to be having that discussion when there's 10 days left in discovery, and then all of a sudden you have to serve subpoenas on a whole bunch of individuals to try and get data at the last minute.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Couple of cases, they're not in the resources slide, but with regard to the possession, custody, control issue and requesting data from BYOD device cell phones that are on eDiscovery today, the In re Pork litigation involving Hormel, and the Charles Oakley litigation involving Madison Square Garden. In both cases, the requesting party submitted third-party subpoenas to the individual mobile device holders, in addition to trying to request from the companies. So they had that fallback when the court said it's not in the company's possession, custody, control, but it was in the individual's possession, custody, control. So definitely a good best practice from a requesting party standpoint. Moving on to text messages, obviously there's a lot of types of messaging platforms to consider, Greg, here. We certainly don't have time to go through all of them, but can you maybe pick out a handful of these and talk about the considerations to keep in mind for some of them?
Sure. So first of all, this is just a great slide for everybody to keep handy in the future, because I don't think we all appreciate how many different kinds of messaging apps are out there. They're just more and more every day. These are ones we have encountered in the real world. So these are not exotic things that we had to go do a Google search to find all these names. These are all things that we've actually really encountered. And as a matter of fact, just this last week, Jabber came across our request list. I'm like, what is Jabber? And so there's always a new one. there's two fundamental kinds. There's the point-to-point ones, like we're all used to on our phones. We can text message, we can have groups in there, but it's designed for point-to-point. It's not an enterprise quality. But then you flip to the enterprise ones, and most of us are familiar with Teams now or Slack. Um, and then to my surprise, Zoom and WebEx have added background chat applications. So these are applications, so you don't have to be involved in a webinar or a Zoom meeting. You can have at an enterprise level chat maintained by Zoom or by WebEx. They both offer this, and you have thousands of channels and messages. It's full blown messaging. So there's just a tremendous variety of things that can be done. But the biggest difference is the enterprise versions with all their channels and again, if you're familiar with Teams or Slack, they both have that pretty commonly. But Zoom, WebEx, they all have these things. Snapchat is one I threw out especially, and I said it's rare to retrieve. So we do come across Snapchat installed on a lot of phones, but we don't often get the messages themselves. So Karuna might have more to say about that, but I'm not familiar with much success there, and I personally haven't tried very often with Snapchat.
All right, good enough. I'll move us to the next slide here, and it's a screenshot from S2 Data's Lear AI platform. So, Greg, could you walk us through using the platform and the use cases for a platform like this, given the ability to review text messages in an eDiscovery review platform?
So this is what I've been focused on very, very significantly for the last 6 or 9 months. And so I'm the primary architect for what we're looking at here, which is why this got some airtime today. But anyway, what we're looking at is a chat message between two people going back and forth. We have the people listed over on the right, and then there's a phone owner. So it's just a typical look and feel like what is on the phone. And I'm very, very demanding that we try to maintain the look and feel of the phone for both the review process and the production process. And in this particular case, you'll see the little bubbles on the left where it says responsive or confidential. So we can tag individual messages or entire daily conversations. So we're taking, and by the way, this is not just this tool. You can do similar things in Relativity, Reveal, Index.io. The idea of doing text message review is common today. This is no longer a specialty or exotic, but this is our solution for this. So we've applied in this case tags for privilege and confidentiality associated with certain messages. And then one thing that's not quite as common, or maybe it's only been around a couple of years, is the ability to select individual messages and create a new sub-conversation. So we've done that historically, or lawyers have done that historically in email. If you had 5,000 emails between me and Doug, and we're to have a litigation, we're not going to turn over all 5,000. We're going to go through them one at a time, look at them, and decide what's responsive and what's not responsive. Well, the same can be true with text messages. You may or may not want to turn over an entire day's conversation or an entire conversation, because again, it might have thousands of individual messages. But even within a day, lawyers are now saying, half of this is responsive, but half of it isn't. What can I do? And so newer review platforms are allowing you to select individual messages, and we allow that here, individual messages, and then create a new subdocument. And we create a new, I don't even know what to call it, but a new document is based upon the old document. It only takes forward the conversation metadata and the individual text message metadata, but that's it. It doesn't take all the other stuff. It also does take the attachments. We see a lot of attachments in text messages now. I did one case where we had 50,000 pages when we PDF'd all the communications off the phone. It's because the person was conducting business on his phone and it was related to vehicles, and there were lots of vehicle photographs. They were all relevant and they were all business communications. So they had to be produced and turned over to the other side as part of the discovery process.
Yeah, and the ability to use a platform like this to go through in kind of an ECA stage of the case and really limit to the relevant conversations, I think can certainly be a big time saver for sure. So obviously we can't forget old-fashioned workstations and hard drives. Greg, obviously here we see the two primary operating systems for workstations are Windows and Mac. So can you discuss the differences between the two and the type of data you could collect from each that could help in your forensic analysis?
Sure. So probably 80% of what we see in the computer world is Windows and 20% Mac OS. And in the Windows world, we get very used to seeing all sorts of artifacts. Windows is not good at cleaning stuff up, which means from a forensic perspective, it's a gold mine of activity. Most of those artifacts I was talking about earlier in my triage reports, that primarily related to Windows. So we have just all sorts of wonderful artifacts and detail in a Windows examination. When we move to Mac OS, it's different. It uses a totally different approach for how it maintains that good metadata, and it seems to rely on the application to maintain it intentionally. So 9 times out of 10, what I get from a Mac when I'm doing analysis is a very limited amount of metadata. Every once in a while, we'll find something very rich because the application is recording a lot more detail. But in general, we don't. And it relies very heavily on what is called the unified message log. That log, unfortunately, overwrites in 7 to 14 days typically. So I've had great detail of what the user did for the last 7 to 14 days, but I don't have a lot going back further. So if I want to know, they come to me and say, what did the user do in the last 30 days or the last 180 days? That's a very common question on a departing employee. The last 6 months, what were they up to? Well, it's really hard for me to tell with the Mac OS. Now, inside the browser, Safari, Chrome, whatever, I have the same level of detail I do on a Mac and a Windows computer. But for actual file interaction, plugging in thumb drives, a lot of the detail that I've really come to rely on, I don't have it in a Mac. So it's really, really hard for me to do that differentiation. Now, one advantage of a Mac is it has snapshots. A lot of users, if you know what a time machine is, it's an external backup device used on Macs. When you plug in a time machine for the first time, it tells the Mac operating system, this person cares about backups. Now, when they remove the time machine, it says, I'm going to continue to make snapshots for this user because I know they care about their data. They want backups. So even though the user may not know it, on disk preservation in place, if you will, from the earlier question, takes place on a Mac, independent of the user even being aware that it's happening once they engage it. And again, it's automatically engaged as soon as they plug in a time machine or an external backup device. And we do utilize those snapshots and get very relevant data off of those at times.
Okay, great. So Neal, obviously Greg's throwing out several technical terms here. So what do you what recommendations do you have for lawyers in our audience about how to understand what's going on from a technical standpoint and what to ask for from your forensic specialists?
I can give you a short answer. Tell your client if this is an important case and you want to make sure that this case is as successful as it can possibly be, hire a forensic examiner like Greg and Karuna at the earliest stage of the case to just help you navigate, what decisions do we need to make? What data do we need to pull? What devices do we need to preserve on our end? What do we need to ask for from the other side? That's going to be invaluable and just give you the edge as your case gets going.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. So Greg, this is obviously a screenshot from S2 Data's Veneer platform. So could you walk us through using a platform like this for reviewing and searching your file listings and why a platform like this is a better option than dumping a file listing into Excel?
Sure. So for the last couple decades, I've been creating file listings in Excel for lawyers. And when it's 10,000 files, it's not fun, but you can get through it. When it starts to be 200,000, 500,000, a million, 2 million, it's like, how am I supposed to review this in Excel? This is not a fun process at all. So we have developed a tool we called Veneer that allows for much easier browsing of the history. And you notice on the left, we have the familiar folder expansion so you can see where you are in the drive. Click around, move around, examine that drive because folder structure is often very, very important and very difficult to pull out of an Excel spreadsheet. But here you can click around, do what you want to do. And then in the center part, you see we have the individual files listed, their create date, last access date, last modified date, and then the size. And that's a huge amount of very valuable data for a lawyer. And then in this case, you can see that I've checked three individual files. We can tag those files in this application and they can send me, this application doesn't have the raw data in it, just this spreadsheet equivalent. Then they can check those and send me a request to say, hey, send me all the files I tagged. I go into the forensic image, pull out those files, send them to the lawyer for their detailed review of the individual files. So it's just a much more 2025 way to do this as opposed to 2005.
Okay, great. Thanks, Greg. Um, I've got two more quick data sources to go, but I'll throw in, since we're getting close to time, one more question from the audience. How do you maintain a list of departed employees and link it to those who are on legal hold? Greg, Karuna, answer on that one, comment on that one?
We tell the lawyer to be sure to do a good job of that.
All right, Neal, anything to add there?
It's all about coaching your clients to just do a good job from an administrative standpoint, especially once a dispute gets going, identify who are the people that might have relevant information, who's left the company, and who do we possibly need to include on a legal hold, right? Be very thoughtful and don't just make it a formality. Don't just send out the standard litigation hold. Just keep you as the lawyer and the client focused on getting it right and being thorough.
All right, great. Obviously data in the cloud, we're getting more and more of that, and that's becoming a predominant data source. Karuna, I had three questions for you. I'm going to kind of really turn over just very quickly address those first three bullet points and talk to us a little bit about the cloud storage syncs to devices, about how the email in the cloud forensic collection differs from on-prem, and also briefly what situations are iCloud located data most likely to be useful to litigation or investigations.
Yep. So redundant data, it's often in multiple locations. It could be across laptops, desktops, cell phones, tablets. Especially if devices haven't been connected to the internet, so they're not syncing and they're not fully synced, rather. You may be deleting files off of one device, but if the other devices have not connected to the internet, they're not going to be in full sync. There are pros and cons to that. If you're collecting data and you want to do some analysis, the juicy bits are, you could have multiple versions of files. So you could have edits, in different locations to a file, and metadata changes, which could be important. Cloud syncs to PCs and Macs can kind of help determine what files were accessed. Typically, what happens is nowadays, if you've got a OneDrive sync or a Google Drive sync, as an example, down to, say, your laptop, you don't need to have a full copy of what's in the cloud on your device. You want to kind of save on storage. So what happens is when you first set up that sync, the folder structure will sync down to your actual device. And as you start accessing files and opening them, then they'll get downloaded to the device. So you can actually look physically at the files on the device to see what has been accessed. You can obviously do that from looking at the file size quite easily. With regards to remediation on a device, if you've got cloud syncs enabled across multiple devices, especially, the remediation part can get really, really tricky. You may have the same data on multiple devices. You don't want to remediate every single device. So typically you would remediate one device, make sure everything's kind of synced to the cloud, and then have all the other devices, do the same sync from the cloud. Remediation is very challenging, and all devices really do need to be kind of synced after that remediation process. There are forensic tools and defensible ways to collect, moving on to the email side of things, to collect email from both personal email and also from like enterprise accounts. The tools now are much easier to use, the forensic tools. And for collecting personal like Gmail, Yahoo, AOL, etc. For Microsoft email or Google Workspace, those kind of enterprise email, you would go into the back end. So you would use, for example, Microsoft Purview or Google Workspace admin panel. That requires typically IT's assistance and or credentials, or sometimes they'll set you up an account. But bear in mind also that there could be multiple email container files like PSTs and OSTs that can be resident on PCs, laptops, desktops. So as a forensic examiner, when we're imaging these devices, we always search for these type of container files and process all of that like we would typically any other, email data. And then just quickly on on iCloud data, iCloud backups and iCloud messages, we kind of talked about previously, those are typically available from iCloud. So even if your device has been lost or if a device has been set to, factory defaults, we can pull that data down and still have, the relevant information we may need. And then other things to note are the Notes app as an example on an iPhone. That often can contain relevant information that people kind of forget. And then I kind of mentioned earlier, photos or videos of company, documents or whiteboards where they were in meetings, those are relevant. You can collect those from the cloud more often than not. And then really the last one is the family sharing features that are available that, especially for Apple devices. So you can reveal like shared content or cross-linked kind of data. I know I zoomed through that because of time, but
Oh, well, that was great, and I hadn't thought of the family shared features, but certainly that makes perfect sense as well. We are a minute past time. I'm going to skip the Google data question for you, Greg, so we can get to USB storage devices, which a lot of people say, do even people use those anymore, but they're definitely an important thing, especially in cases involving departed employees. So Greg, can you briefly talk about how the file system comes into play when analyzing these devices and what the difference is between snapshots, shadow copies, and time machine backups?
Yeah, I will fly through this. So NTFS is the file system we see a lot on, of course, Windows computers, but also on larger external drives. And NTFS is great because it has more metadata than any other format. We could have the creation date, which is when data was placed or a file was placed on an external drive. And then we have the last access date, which is typically maintained quite well on NTFS. With FAT32, which is used on your smaller thumb drives, the last access date is just accurate to the day, not to the minute, which is very annoying because some people might put data on there in the morning, go to their house and pull it back off. And we have no way to track that level of granularity with a simple thumb drive. Anyway, Mac OS has the HFS file system. I hardly ever see that on a storage device. I won't say never, but it's just not common. Almost always it's in TFS or FAT. Snapshots and shadow copies, those are preservation in place techniques that both Windows, which uses snapshots, and Mac, which uses, I've got that backwards. Mac use snapshots, Windows uses shadow copies, but they're both preservation in place techniques. We see both of those in the real world, and then when we come across them, we leverage them. They're not designed for litigation hold, so that's not what that is, but it's just keeping some backups so we can come back along later. And then time machine backups are great because people sometimes have years worth of backups on their time machines. So we can go to those time machines and pull out backups from this year, last year, whatever it may be. They are intentionally done. They're not typically done on a schedule. So typically they're very random in nature what the time frame is, but it's a full backup of the Mac computer. So very useful.
All right. Thanks for flying through it and still covering it. So appreciate that. We have hit all the questions we've received. And just to show you, here's the resources slide with links to some of the cases, a couple of which we referenced here, and definitely some good cases involving departed employees. So since we are past time, I'll skip the final question and just say thanks to all of you for attending today. I believe, I don't know if Mike is coming back to close us out. I don't think so. So,
I'm right here, Doug.
oh, you are here. Okay, then you are coming back to close us out. Woo! So I will turn it back over to Mike to do so. And so I certainly want to thank our panelists for cramming as much information as we could in 90 minutes. Who knew we really needed more like 120 minutes to cover all this? But we got a lot in there, and definitely appreciate all your expertise and advice.
All right. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Karuna. Thank you to Neal and Greg as well for a fantastic presentation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on the ACEDS webinar channel. Thanks to eDiscovery today. And please subscribe to eDiscovery today at ediscoverytoday.com. Thanks for a great presentation. Please, everyone, visit aceds.org for a complete list of upcoming webinars. Have a great day, everyone, and be kind to one another.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.